I am Claire Whitaker, 32 years old, and until just a few weeks ago, I was an ordinary kindergarten teacher living paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment. My grandparents raised me more than my own parents ever did. They were wealthy, but they lived simply, always reminding me that character matters more than cash. When they died suddenly in a terrible car crash, I was shattered. Then came the meeting with the lawyer where I learned they had left me their entire $26 million estate. The family that had barely visited them in years suddenly wanted everything. I said no. If you want to see how money can reveal true colors, stay with me. Before I go on, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about standing your ground when family turns greedy. The air inside the conference room was heavy wood-paneled walls pressing in as though they knew the storm about to unfold. I sat at the long oak table, my palms damp against the smooth surface, while my father adjusted his cufflinks with impatient jerks, and my mother shifted in her chair like she was perched on thorns. My brother Brian tapped his foot so loudly it echoed through the hush, as if he could summon the fortune faster by sheer noise. The attorney Daniel Harris adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. His voice was calm, deliberate, with that steady tone of someone who had done this many times before. And yet to me, every word felt like the sound of a lock clicking shut, sealing my fate. When he said the estate was mine alone, I swear the room tilted. My breath caught, and for a heartbeat I thought I might faint right there in front of them all. It wasn't joy I felt. Not pride, not triumph. It was a shock, like standing in the center of a thunderclap. And before I could process, before I could even form words, the eruption began. My father's fist slammed down so hard the water glasses rattled. "This is ridiculous. A teacher with millions." His eyes cut into me as though my profession itself was an insult to his name. My mother's lips tightened into a sharp line, the kind she wore whenever she thought something beneath her. She whispered my name not with affection, but with disgust, stretching it out as if it were poison on her tongue. Brian shot up from his seat. His chair screeched across the floor, the sound jagged, ugly. His hand flattened against the table. "You can't be serious. You're telling me all of it goes to her." "All of it." Daniel didn't flinch. "This was your parents' choice. Their legacy, not a mistake." Legacy. That word settled in my chest heavier than the dollar amount. It wasn't just about property or accounts or the logistics company they had built. It was about everything they had taught me over decades of Sunday dinners and quiet evenings in their garden. And here it was, compressed into one envelope on the table, sealed, waiting. I lowered my gaze to it, afraid of meeting their eyes again. The envelope was thick, the lawyer's neat handwriting across its face, the weight of it pulling at the polished oak. My fingers twitched before reaching forward, brushing its corner. The paper was cool, rough at the edge, as though it carried frost from the grave. I thought of their hands, the hands that once guided mine in baking pies and planting tomatoes, and my throat closed. For a heartbeat, everything slowed. The shouts dulled to a hum. My father's glare blurred, my mother's scoff became distant. All I could hear was the thud of my pulse in my ears, steady, stubborn. The room full of fury dissolved, until there was only me, the envelope, and the echo of voices long gone. But then reality crashed back. My father leaned closer, his breath sharp with scotch and rage. "This will never hold. They were confused, manipulated. No judge will let this stand." Daniel met his eyes evenly. "They were tested by independent doctors. Your parents were clear-minded when they made this decision." His calmness only seemed to feed my father's fury. Brian snorted, pacing now. "She doesn't even know how to handle money. She'll blow it all in a year. Give it to me. I have plans, startups, opportunities, plans." That word from his mouth was a curse. Every one of his so-called opportunities had ended with bills unpaid and doors slammed shut, and still in his mind the money was already his. My mother finally spoke, her voice sweet as honey, dripping with venom. "Darling, you understand this isn't right. Family wealth belongs to the family, not just you. You'll share, won't you?" Her eyes narrowed, her smile brittle, rehearsed. I wanted to scream, to ask them when family had ever meant me. When had they shown up at my school plays, or sat with me through fevers, or asked how my day was? My voice failed me, then stuck behind the lump in my throat. I could only place my hand flat against the envelope, feeling the thickness of it, a shield between me and them. The silence stretched charged until Brian exploded again, pounding the table. She thinks she's better than us. That's why she stayed with them, sucking up to them, waiting for this. The accusation was a blade, though I had expected it. They never understood that my love for my grandparents wasn't about money. It was about belonging, about being seen, about the way my grandfather clapped the loudest at my recitals and my grandmother slipped notes into my lunchbox with hearts drawn in blue ink. Daniel's voice broke through, steady as stone. Enough. His hand moved toward the envelope, sliding it closer to me. This is hers, and nothing in this room can change that. My father barked a laugh, hollow, bitter. We'll see about that. He turned to me, then his eyes not of a father, but of a man facing an enemy. You have a choice, Claire. Either you hand it over, or you'll regret it. The threat hung thick and suffocating. I couldn't speak. I lowered my eyes once more, my fingertips tracing the flap of the envelope. The paper crinkled slightly, whispering secrets only I could hear. Behind my eyelids, memories stirred, and suddenly I wasn't in that suffocating room anymore. I was small again, standing in my grandparents' kitchen, the smell of apple pie filling the air. The voices of anger faded, replaced by the warm murmur of my grandmother. Character over cash, Claire. Always. And with that whisper echoing, the room dissolved into memory. I remember being small enough that my feet didn't touch the kitchen floor when I sat at the counter. My grandmother's hands moved with the kind of patience only decades could teach, folding flour into butter, coaxing dough into something alive. She set a little bowl in front of me, sprinkled it with flour, and guided my fingers into it. The smell of cinnamon and apples filled the air, warm and comforting, and the sound of her laughter rose like music above the hum of the old refrigerator. That kitchen was the heart of my childhood. Yellow curtains faded in the sun, a clock that ticked too loudly on the wall. Jars of preserves lined up neatly, their handwritten labels tilted at different angles. When my world felt uncertain, that kitchen anchored me. My grandmother's voice was steady, instructive, and full of love. Stir slower, Claire. Let the dough breathe. She believed cooking wasn't about recipes, it was about listening. My grandfather would appear at the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag after tinkering in the garden or fixing something in the garage. He would lean against the frame and watch us, his smile wide, his presence steady. He didn't speak much in those moments, but his eyes told me everything. That I was safe, that I belonged, that I was loved. Contrast that with my parents' house across town. The difference was night and day. My father, Edward, was always buried in work. I remember once asking if he could come to a school play. He looked at his phone, muttered about a client dinner, and never brought it up again. My mother, Catherine, was no different. Her life was consumed by luncheons and social circles, planning charity galas where the charity often seemed like an accessory to her dress. The truth is, I wasn't their center. I was an obligation they managed, something to feed and clothe but not truly see. My grandparents, Margaret and Thomas Whitaker, became the ones who raised me. They stepped in, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I remember nights when storms rattled the windows of their house. I'd wake trembling, clutching the quilt my grandmother had sewn from scraps of fabric, each square a memory from years past. She would come sit beside me, stroke my hair, and whisper the same words every time. Money is a tool, Claire, not a measure of your worth. People will try to tell you otherwise. Don't believe them. That quilt became more than a blanket. It was a shield, a symbol of every ounce of love they poured into me. Even as an adult, it stayed folded on my bed, worn but strong, stitched with their philosophy. But childhood wasn't only tender moments. There were times when the cracks in my parents' relationship with my grandparents showed through, sharp and jagged. I once overheard my father in their living room, his voice low but edged with frustration. He had asked them for a large sum, another business investment that smelled more like a gamble. When my grandfather refused, insisting he work for it like everyone else, my father's tone turned bitter. Stingy, outdated. You hoard money like it makes you saints. I froze in the hallway, barely breathing, the words lodging in my chest like stones. My grandmother stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. Edward, we've given you more than enough. A house, a college education, support when you needed it, but entitlement is not the same as love. I peeked in, saw my father's face twisted with resentment, and in that moment I understood why I never felt truly welcome in my parents' house. That night when I crawled under my quilt, I thought about the sharp divide between the two worlds I straddled. One was cold, all appearances and obligations. The other was warm, grounded in values that couldn't be bought. I knew where I belonged. My grandparents made ordinary days extraordinary. Grandpa would take me into the garden, showing me how to stake tomatoes, his hands guiding mine around the thin stems. See how it leans, Claire? Everything needs support to grow straight. I didn't realize until much later that he wasn't only talking about plants. On Sunday evenings, Grandma would invite me to choose a storybook, and we'd sit by the fire as she read aloud, her voice weaving magic through the room. My parents never came for those nights. They said Sundays were for rest, but their version of rest never included me. Still, I never resented them the way you might expect. I stopped hoping they would show up because the love I received from my grandparents filled the hollow spaces. I carried that quilt, those words, those lessons like a secret inheritance long before money was ever mentioned. Years later, when I moved into my tiny apartment as an adult, I brought almost nothing new. Second-hand furniture, thrift store dishes, borrowed books. But that quilt lay across my bed like a crown jewel. On nights when exhaustion settled heavily after long hours of teaching, I would run my hands over its fraying threads, feeling the presence of my grandparents. It reminded me that I wasn't defined by my paycheck but by the care I gave the lives I touched. One evening, I sat at my small kitchen table, lesson plans spread out when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number, but something in my chest tightened as I answered. The officer's voice was solemn, measured, and in a few words, my world split open. A drunk driver, a red light, instant, no suffering, no goodbye. The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor. I sat frozen, staring at the quilt folded neatly on the bed across the room. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a shield. It felt like a goodbye gift I wasn't ready to accept. I pressed it to my face and cried until the fabric was damp, until the smell of lavender detergent and old cotton filled my lungs, until there was nothing left but silence and grief. That was the moment I realized values outlast people, but they don't erase the ache of losing them. And that was the moment everything began to change. The next morning, the sun came up as usual, indifferent to my loss. I sat by the window wrapped in that quilt, staring at a city that moved on while my world stood still. My parents called, but not to ask how I was coping. They asked about funeral arrangements, about costs, about appearances. Their voices were sharp, impatient, focused on logistics rather than loss. I answered numbly, listening as they debated caskets and flower budgets, each remark cutting deeper than the last. They had lost their parents, yet grief seemed to inconvenience them. I hung up and turned to the quilt again, my only anchor. In that silence, I remembered my grandfather's words about money being a tool. It struck me that for my parents, money had never been a tool. It had been the goal, the weapon, the measure. For my grandparents, it had been a way to build a life, a family, a community. And now somehow I was caught in the middle, holding both philosophies like live wires. I didn't know then what storm was waiting. I didn't know that a sealed envelope in a lawyer's office would ignite every resentment, every buried wound. All I knew in that moment was that love had left the world with two people in a single instant, and the only thing keeping me upright was a quilt and the memory of voices telling me who I truly was. The phone rang again, startling me out of my haze. It was Daniel Harris, the attorney my grandparents had trusted for decades. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of something final. "Claire, we need to meet. There are matters regarding the estate." I glanced at the quilt on my lap, my hands gripping its edges. Estate, legacy, words that felt too large for me, words I never thought would belong in my story. And yet here they were, pulling me toward a room where my parents and brother would be waiting, ready to claim what they believed was theirs. I didn't know it yet, but the quilt I clung to would be the thread that connected everything: love loss, betrayal, and the fight for what was right. And as I reached for my coat, the phone still warm in my hand, the air shifted. The transition was complete. I was no longer just a granddaughter. I was the unwilling heir to a battle that had only just begun. The funeral should have been about grief, about honoring two lives that had shaped mine in every way, but instead it became a performance stage. The first hint came even before the service began. My parents stood at the side of the funeral director, their voices sharp, cutting through the heavy air of the chapel. My father insisted the mid-range casket was beneath them, that only the highest-end model would suffice. My mother countered that the more expensive one looked too plain, that the finish did not reflect the family's stature. They weren't talking about love or memory. They were negotiating as if they were buying a car. I stood a few steps away, frozen, clutching the quilt I had folded in my arms like a shield. My grandparents deserved reverence, not arguments over price tags. Each back and forth felt like a knife. The funeral director tried to keep his tone neutral, offering explanations about durability and tradition, but his eyes darted toward me as though he recognized the absurdity of it all. By the time the service began, the chapel was filled with relatives and acquaintances who hadn't spoken to my grandparents in years. The air smelled faintly of lilies and cologne, but beneath it all was the stench of pretense. My Aunt Janet sat in the front row, her face a mask of devastation. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, sighing dramatically for the benefit of those around her. Yet only moments later, I caught the glow of her phone screen. Her lips curled into a smile as she whispered into the receiver about a new event at her country club. Her laugh rang out briefly before she caught my gaze and quickly resumed her somber pose. The pacing of the day was relentless. A stream of condolences came one after another, people pressing my hand, telling me how wonderful my grandparents had been. Their words sounded hollow, memorized the same lines repeated with different voices. Each phrase blurred into the next, and I wondered how many of them had even visited in the last decade. I nodded politely, my throat tight, but inside I felt myself drifting further away, as though grief had pushed me outside of my own body. When the casket was carried to the front, I could hardly breathe. It was too polished, too shiny, reflecting the fluorescent lights above like a mirror. My grandparents had lived simply, never caring for luxury, yet here was a vessel that seemed designed to impress rather than honor. I reached out when no one was looking, my fingertips brushing the cool surface. It was hard, unyielding, a far cry from the warmth they had always given. That gleaming casket became a symbol of everything wrong with the day: appearance over substance, show over sincerity. Voices kept clashing in the background. My father barked orders at ushers demanding better seating for certain business acquaintances. My mother corrected flower arrangements, snapping at the staff about color choices. Their focus was entirely on optics. To them, this was not a farewell, it was a production. I kept my eyes fixed on the casket, whispering silently to my grandparents that I was sorry. Sorry their lives ended in such chaos. Sorry they could not see how love was being drowned by ambition. The twist came when I stepped into the family lounge during a break in the service. I needed airspace away from the suffocating theatrics. I pushed the door open quietly and froze. My mother stood by a small side table, her back to me. She opened the jewelry box that had been set out with mementos. Her fingers darted inside and emerged with my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one she wore on anniversaries, the one she had promised to pass to me one day. My mother slipped it into her purse with a swift, practiced motion, then zipped it shut. I inhaled sharply, the sound betraying me. She spun around, her face tightening before she plastered on a soft smile. "Claire, you startled me." She reached for a tissue as though she had been crying, but her eyes were dry, sharp as glass. I wanted to scream to accuse her, but my voice failed. All I could manage was a shaky nod before backing out of the room. The image of that necklace disappearing into her bag burned into me. In that moment, I understood more clearly than ever. This funeral was not about mourning, it was about claiming. My grandparents' bodies had barely cooled, and already pieces of their life were being carved away, hidden, stolen. When the service resumed, I sat in the pew, numb. Janet leaned over, whispering with practiced sorrow that we'd all miss them dearly. The words were barely out of her mouth before her phone buzzed again, and her smile slipped back bright and shallow. I watched the performance unfold around me, each gesture exaggerated, each tear convenient. I felt like the only person in the room truly grieving, the only one whose loss was not measured in dollars. As the pallbearers moved the casket toward the doors, the sound of the organ swelled. I stepped forward, my hand reaching once more to press against the polished wood, cold, lifeless, unforgiving. My reflection wavered on its surface, a distorted image of myself fractured and bent. I whispered goodbye, the words sticking in my throat. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind, soft and steady. Money is a tool, Claire, not a measure of your worth. But in that moment, I realized others in the room believed the opposite. To them, worth was measured in carats, in polished wood, in inheritance waiting to be divided. I closed my eyes and let my hand linger, holding on to what little I could before they carried it away. When I opened them again, the doors swung wide and the cold gray light of the afternoon spilled into the chapel. I stepped back, my heart heavy, my mind clouded. Outside, the sky had darkened, heavy clouds pressing low as if the heavens themselves disapproved. The air was sharp with the smell of rain, and I knew it would fall soon. The theatrics inside the chapel contrasted painfully with the storm brewing outside. As I followed the procession out, my hand still tingling from the casket's touch, I lifted my gaze to the sky. The clouds churned restless, their darkness mirroring the weight in my chest. The service ended not with closure, but with questions. Who truly mourned? Who saw love? And who saw opportunity? The answer was clear, even if no one would admit it. Not all who cry are grieving, and not every show of sorrow is born from love. That day, I walked away, not just with grief, but with the first seeds of suspicion. Seeds that would grow into a battle I never wanted, but could no longer avoid. The conference room smelled faintly of leather and old wood polish, the kind of scent that clung to spaces where secrets had been whispered for decades. I sat at one end of the long table, hands pressed into my lap so tightly that my nails bit crescents into my skin. My parents sat across from me, father rigid in his suit, mother's pearls glinting against her throat, and Brian slouched with his sunglasses perched unnecessarily on his head, as if this were another casual meeting. At the head of the table, Daniel Harris straightened the leather folder before him. When he spoke, his voice carried not just authority, but finality. I, Thomas Whitaker, and I, Margaret Whitaker, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this our last will. The air seemed to still, every breath suspended. He read through the formal language, the legal phrasing. I barely followed, words about revoking prior documents and appointing executors. My father shifted impatiently. My mother sighed heavily. Brian tapped his fingers against the wood in an uneven rhythm. Then Daniel's voice deepened, and he said the words that detonated like a bomb in that paneled room. We bequeath our entire estate to our beloved granddaughter Claire Whitaker. The rest of the sentence blurred, though I caught fragments: cash, assets, property, company shares, investments. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the silence that followed, thick, deadly, suffocating. I felt my ears ring, my pulse hammering. The fortune I had never asked for, never dreamed would be mine, now rested entirely on my shoulders. My father reacted first. He shot to his feet, chair scraping back so violently it toppled. His face was crimson, veins bulging at his temples. They were senile. This is absurd. Daniel's voice remained even. They passed cognitive tests, documented, witnessed, and signed by independent physicians. Their decision was deliberate. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, then snapped shut into a thin line. She leaned forward, her tone laced with poison. A teacher does not know how to manage millions. She will squander it. This is irresponsible. Brian slammed his palm onto the table, rattling the glasses of water. What about me? I'm their grandson, too. I have plans. I couldn't move. My fingers curled tighter in my lap, my nails drawing blood against my palm. The word estate echoed in my head louder than their voices. It wasn't the number that stunned me, but the trust it represented. Theirs was a deliberate choice. They had seen me, valued me, believed in me. Daniel reached for the remote control on the table. There is something more, he said quietly. Thomas and Margaret anticipated confusion. They left a message. The screen on the wall flickered to life. Light spilled into the dim room, casting shadows on the paneling. My breath caught as my grandparents appeared, sitting side by side on their familiar sofa. My grandmother wore her blue cardigan, the one she always chose for comfort, and my grandfather leaned slightly forward, his hands clasped. My eyes filled instantly. It was as though they were alive again. If you are watching this, it means we have passed. My grandfather began. His voice was steady, gentle, carrying the weight of finality. We want to explain our decision so there is no misunderstanding. My grandmother's voice followed, warm yet firm. Edward, Catherine, Brian. We love you as our family, but we have been deeply disappointed by the choices you've made. My father scoffed loudly, but no one looked away from the screen. We watched as my grandparents spoke with clarity, recounting years of absence of requests for money that were never repaid, of disdain for their simple way of life. This company, this home, everything we built, was never about wealth for its own sake, my grandfather continued. It was about security, integrity, and opportunity for others. And Claire is the one who has lived those values. My grandmother's eyes, even on screen, seemed to pierce straight into me. She visits us not because she wants something, but because she cares. She has chosen a life of service, teaching children and living simply. We trust her to honor what we built. The video ended, the light from the screen fading, leaving the room darker than before. My chest ached. Their words wrapped around me like the quilt my grandmother had sewn, both heavy and protective. My father exploded, manipulated. They were confused, old. This is invalid. Daniel met his fury with stillness. Their statements were recorded over multiple sessions. Their clarity was evident. Their doctors signed off. There is no question of competence. Brian's face twisted. So she gets everything, while we get nothing. My mother turned her gaze to me, her smile brittle. Claire, sweetheart, you can't believe this is right. Family wealth is for the family. Surely you'll share. The word share hung in the air like a trap. My throat closed, my heart pounding, but I said nothing. I stared at the envelope Daniel slid toward me. Inside was everything: keys, documents, codes to accounts. I didn't dare touch it. My father leaned closer, his voice a growl. You cannot stand against us. Either you hand it over willingly, or we will contest it. Daniel interjected, calm but firm. Contesting will be costly, time-consuming, and unlikely to succeed. Your parents were meticulous. Every step was documented. My father's chair scraped violently as he shoved it back upright. He slammed it against the table with such force that the sound reverberated through the room. The glassware shook. My heart leapt into my throat. His glare seared into me as though I were an enemy, not his daughter. The tension was unbearable. My mother hissed under her breath. A teacher with millions. What a joke. Brian muttered curses, pacing like a caged animal. I kept my hand on the envelope, my fingers trembling. I wanted to vanish, to dissolve into the floor, but I couldn't. Instead, I closed my eyes. For a moment, I let myself be somewhere else. I imagined the scent of my grandmother's kitchen, the hum of my grandfather's whistle, the safety of Sunday dinners. When I opened my eyes again, I felt the weight of the envelope steady beneath my palm. My voice was barely a whisper, but I managed. They chose me. The room erupted, but I didn't flinch. My father's roar, my mother's sharp retorts. Brian's demands, they blurred into background noise. I pressed my hand flat against the envelope, grounding myself. Daniel stood, gathering his papers. This meeting is adjourned. The gavel might as well have fallen. As the family stormed out, their angry footsteps echoing down the hall, I remained seated, staring at the envelope. It looked ordinary paper and ink, yet it held the future of my life, the fracture of my family, the proof that I had mattered to someone. Finally, I rose, my legs unsteady. I clutched the envelope to my chest as if it were a lifeline. When I stepped outside, the sky had opened, rain cascading down in heavy sheets. The storm soaked through my coat, plastered my hair to my face, but I barely felt it. Each drop was a baptism, washing away the last illusions I had held about family. I walked into the rain, the city blurred by water and grief, carrying an envelope that would change everything. We need to sort this out as a family. Those were my father's words when he called me the evening after the will reading. His voice was sharp, businesslike, as though he were summoning me to a boardroom and not to the home where I had grown up. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, the quilt folded in my lap, phone pressed to my ear. The word family tasted bitter after the chaos in that conference room, but I agreed. Some part of me still wanted to believe reconciliation was possible. When I arrived, the driveway was already crowded, with their cars' polished metal gleaming under the porch light. My parents' house looked imposing, larger than life, all stone and glass, designed to impress neighbors rather than welcome anyone inside. As I climbed the steps, the weight of the envelope with the estate documents pressed against my chest from inside my coat. I had not opened it yet. Carrying it felt like carrying a loaded weapon, one I wasn't ready to use. The door opened before I knocked. My mother stood there, her smile tight, her perfume overwhelming. She gestured me in without warmth. In the living room, my father stood by the fireplace, a tumbler of scotch in his hand, his posture like a general awaiting a soldier. Brian sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone, while Aunt Janet perched nearby, whispering to herself about renovations she would make if she had a house like my grandparents'. My father's eyes pinned me the moment I stepped inside. "Sit down, Claire." His tone brooked no refusal. I sat in a chair near the door, instinctively choosing the seat closest to an exit. My pulse quickened. The pacing of the evening was already fast, a current pulling me into something dangerous. My father began. "Your grandparents were confused. They let sentiment cloud judgment. You know this estate belongs to the family. We need to reassign it properly." My mother leaned forward, her eyes bright with calculation. "We invested enough in you. Now it's time you give back." The words sliced through me. Invested. As though my childhood were a portfolio, my education, a transaction, my very existence, an account they could balance at will. Brian looked up from his phone and smirked. "Yeah, sis. You can't possibly handle all that money. I've got business plans ready. Crypto apps, real growth. Just sign it over and we'll manage it better." My fingers tightened around the quilt in my lap. My voice shook, but I found words. They trusted me. My father's glass hit the mantel with a thud. "Don't confuse misplaced affection with sound judgment. You sign those papers tonight, and this whole mess goes away." Daniel Harris's warning echoed in my mind. "They will try to force you. They will play every card they have." I shook my head. "I can't." The air snapped with tension. My mother's voice dropped low and dangerous. "You think you can defy us? Fine. But maybe you should think about where you live." I frowned, not understanding. She smiled coldly. "Did you really think your little apartment was yours?" My father stepped in. "That building belongs to one of our investment companies. We signed your lease because you couldn't qualify on your own salary. Technically, we own your place. Consider this notice. You have 30 minutes to pack essentials. The locks will be changed tomorrow." My breath left me in a rush. My apartment, my one sanctuary, wasn't mine at all. The floor seemed to shift beneath me. I clutched the quilt tighter, the fabric digging into my palms. Brian chuckled, leaning back. Better hurry, Claire. That fortune won't keep you warm tonight. My mother stood checking her watch. We'll expect your signature after you've had time to think. But tonight you're out. The pacing of the evening had escalated into frenzy. My heart pounded as I stumbled to my feet. Words failed me, tangled in my throat. All I could manage was a whisper. You're really doing this. My father's eyes were cold steel. This is business, not sentiment. The twist had landed with brutal precision. I was not only disinherited from their love, but I was also exiled from my own life. The quilt in my arms was the only thing truly mine. I turned toward the door. No one stopped me. My footsteps echoed on the marble floor, sharp against the silence. When I stepped outside, the night air cut through my coat. My breath curled white in the cold, fading into the darkness. I paused on the porch, clutching the quilt close, the stitches rough against my cheek. Behind me, the house glowed warm, but it was a warmth I no longer belonged to. Ahead, the night stretched uncertain and merciless. The message was clear. When ambition rules, blood ties dissolve. Family becomes a contract and love a currency. I walked down the steps into the cold, each breath a cloud in the air, each step carrying me further from the illusion of belonging. The night I left my parents' house with nothing but my quilt and the envelope Daniel had given me, I thought I had lost everything. My apartment was no longer mine. My family had turned me into an enemy, and the estate felt more like a curse than a gift. I drove aimlessly through the dark streets until my headlights illuminated the familiar outline of my grandparents' home. Their porch light glowed faintly still on its old timer, waiting for a return that would never come. My chest ached at the sight, but something inside me whispered that I belonged here. The next morning I sat at the old oak table in their kitchen, the quilt draped over my shoulders like armor. Sunlight seeped in through the lace curtains, touching every surface with a fragile kind of hope. That's when Daniel arrived, his briefcase heavy, his expression both solemn and steady. He set it down with care, like he knew it carried more than paper. They prepared for this exact moment, Claire, he said softly. He clicked the latches and opened the case. Inside was a wooden box, polished but plain, the kind of thing my grandfather would have chosen. Daniel slid it toward me. My fingers hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside lay neatly stacked folders, envelopes, and one leather-bound notebook. The smell of paper and ink rose, mingling with the faint scent of cedar. It wasn't wealth in the traditional sense. It was something deeper. Evidence. Memory. A shield against everything my family had already begun to plot. Daniel placed his hand on the box. Your grandparents knew your father and mother would contest, he explained. They spent years documenting. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. They wanted to ensure their legacy could not be twisted. I lifted the leather book, its surface worn smooth by my grandmother's hands. My chest tightened at the sight of her familiar handwriting on the first page, looping and precise. The entry was dated just over a year ago. May 15th. Edward visited today after 7 months of silence. No questions about our health. No interest in Claire. He came only to demand $250,000 for a cryptocurrency scheme. When we refused, he accused us of favoring Claire and stormed out. I swallowed hard. The words were simple, but they carried a weight no argument could erase. I turned the page. Another date, another entry. October 3rd. Catherine arrived unannounced. She said the house embarrassed her in front of her friends, that we should sell and buy something grander. When I said no, she called us stubborn, unwilling to change. She took pearls from my dresser, said she'd return them, but she never did. Tears blurred my vision. The memory of catching my mother at the funeral replayed, her hand slipping my grandmother's necklace into her purse. Here was proof that it wasn't a moment of grief-driven impulse. It was a pattern. Daniel's voice broke into my thoughts. There are records of every visit, every request, every insult. Margaret kept them faithfully. She knew this day might come. I flipped further, my hands trembling. June 22nd. Brian came today. He spoke of an app idea. Needed 50,000 to launch. We asked for a business plan. He laughed and said family doesn't need contracts. We said no. He left angry, muttering that Claire would pay for our stinginess someday. Each entry pulled me deeper into their foresight. They had seen the entitlement grow year after year, had endured the demands, and had chosen to prepare not to fight in life, but to protect in death. I placed the notebook gently on the table, afraid to damage the words that had become my grandparents' voice. My throat was raw, but I whispered, "Thank you." Daniel handed me another folder. Inside were photographs of bank transfers, copies of checks never repaid, and emails with subject lines demanding assistance. Attached to each was a note in my grandmother's handwriting documenting context and outcome. Together they formed a mosaic of truth. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it pressing down. It was overwhelming but also liberating. For the first time since the reading of the will, I felt something other than fear. I felt a sliver of strength. Daniel watched me carefully. "This is your weapon, Claire. Quiet, undeniable. They can scream, they can threaten, but they cannot erase what is written here." The pacing of the morning slowed. I sat for hours, turning pages, letting the inked lines steady me. Each entry became a thread stitching together a defense my grandparents had carefully woven. Their voices lived in the margins, their values in the details. At one point, I stopped my hand flat on the open book. A specific passage caught me. January 9th. Claire visited today with the soup she made herself. We played cards by the fire. She laughed when Thomas cheated and accused him with mock outrage. She asked nothing of us. She brought only herself. I pressed my hand harder against the page, tears falling freely. That was the difference, so clear even in their final words. I had given them presents. My parents had given them demands. The twist was not just that my grandparents had left everything to me. It was that they had built a fortress of truth around their decision. A fortress no lawyer, no threat, no manipulation could breach. As the sun began to set, I closed the notebook and looked at Daniel. "What do I do now?" "You live with dignity," he said. "You use what they gave you, not just to survive but to honor them. And when your family comes, and they will, you stand your ground." That night I sat at the desk in my old bedroom, the same desk where I once did homework under my grandmother's watchful eye. I opened the notebook again, letting the lamplight spill across the page. The ink shimmered faintly, every stroke of the pen alive. I traced the words with my finger, hearing their voices, feeling their presence. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Outside the world was dark, but inside their records lit a path. I realized then that preparation was their final gift. Love had guided their actions, but wisdom had armed them for the future. As dawn approached, pale light seeping through the curtains, I closed the notebook carefully, almost reverently. The sky outside shifted from gray to pink, a fragile promise of a new day. I whispered into the stillness, "I'll be ready." Because now I had more than grief. I had proof, and proof, unlike love in my family, could not be denied. I woke the next morning in my grandparents' house, with the quilt still wrapped around me and the leather notebook open on the desk. The words my grandmother had written glowed in the soft light of dawn, like they were still alive, still speaking to me through ink and paper. My chest felt heavy but steadier. For the first time, I understood that I was not defenseless. They had built something around me, a wall of truth, but I still felt utterly alone. That feeling cracked later that afternoon when the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the empty hallways, startling me. I hesitated before opening the door, half expecting to see my father's furious face. Instead, I found Carlos standing there. He had been my grandparents' caretaker for years, tending the grounds, fixing whatever broke, always in the background, but always dependable. His cap was in his hands, his eyes kind but urgent. "Miss Claire," he said, lowering his voice. "I think it's time you see something." He stepped inside and set a laptop on the kitchen table. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, clicking through files. "Your father installed cameras years ago, but last year Mr. Whitaker had me upgrade the system. He didn't trust the old one. It recorded everything inside and out." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Carlos met my eyes. "They thought no one was watching." He pressed play. The footage filled the screen, grainy but clear enough. The date stamp showed the evening of the funeral. My breath caught as I saw my mother on the video slipping into my grandmother's study. She moved quickly, her eyes darting around before pulling open drawers. Her hands reached for the jewelry box, lifting pearl necklaces and gold bracelets, slipping them into her purse. My chest burned with fury and sorrow. I had seen her steal once, but here was proof she had done it without shame, even as guests mourned downstairs. I covered my mouth, staring at the reflection of the footage in my own eyes on the screen. The betrayal cut deeper than any words she had spoken. Carlos clicked pause, the image frozen on her hand halfway into the drawer. The silence in the room was suffocating. "There's more," he said, his voice grim. He opened another file. This time Brian appeared on screen. He was in the garage, rummaging through boxes, pulling out electronics and watches, stuffing them into a duffel bag. He looked over his shoulder, once smirking, unaware of the new camera hidden in the corner. My hands trembled. This wasn't grief. This wasn't family. This was looting. I forced myself to speak, my voice hoarse. "Thank you for showing me." Carlos nodded. "They think they can take everything. But your grandparents planned for this. You are not alone." As he spoke, the front door opened again. I stiffened until I saw Daniel Harris step in, holding more folders under his arm. He greeted Carlos with a nod, then looked at me. "I see you've started." On the table, he laid out more documents, copies of deeds, receipts of charitable donations, letters my grandparents had written. He opened one folder and pulled out signed statements from doctors confirming their mental clarity when the will was written. Every detail was documented. While Daniel explained, another knock came. This time it was Dorothy, the housekeeper, who had been with my grandparents for decades. She carried a small box, her expression solemn but warm. "I thought you should have this," she said, placing it on the table. Inside were handwritten letters my grandmother had tucked away, each addressed to me. Some were short, just notes of encouragement. Others described family gatherings, her disappointments, her hopes for me. One line in particular made my chest ache. "Claire, if they ever try to take away what we gave you, remember that truth has witnesses." By the time Dorothy left, the kitchen table was crowded with evidence and voices of the past. Carlos showed me more footage, each clip reinforcing the truth. My mother is taking jewels, Brian is sneaking electronics, my father is rifling through files in the study. Aunt Janet is pocketing a silver brooch. They had all revealed themselves, not knowing the house itself was watching. The pacing of the day shifted with each visitor, each revelation adding another layer. What had started as overwhelming loneliness was slowly being replaced by a quiet sense of support. They weren't family by blood, but they were people my grandparents had trusted. That trust now extended to me. Daniel tapped the folders with his pen. They prepared for this exact moment. Their love for you wasn't naive, Claire. It was deliberate. They wanted you to stand on truth, not sentiment. I stared at the frozen footage of my mother on the screen, her hand inside the jewelry drawer. My reflection wavered on the glass of the laptop, my eyes wide with disbelief. The betrayal was real, undeniable, but so was the protection surrounding me. For hours, I listened, read, and watched. Each record, each entry, each video clip felt like another stone in the wall my grandparents had built around me. The anger that had consumed me began to settle into something stronger. Resolve. As night fell, Carlos clicked the mouse, the video pausing with a soft sound that echoed in the quiet room. The screen went dark, leaving me staring at my own reflection again. The table before me was covered in papers, photographs, and the leather notebook opened to another entry. The lamp cast a pool of light over the page, illuminating my grandmother's careful handwriting. I leaned closer, my finger tracing her words. "Love without preparation is fragile. We wanted to leave you more than money. We wanted to leave you armor. I closed my eyes, the words sinking into me. I was no longer defenseless. My grandparents' truth preserved in ink and video had given me allies, had given me strength. When I opened my eyes, the night was deep, but a faint glow stretched along the horizon. Dawn was coming. I sat in the pool of lamplight, the pages before me, the quilt around my shoulders, and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. I felt ready. The house was quieter than I'd ever known it, and in that silence, the pendulum of the old grandfather clock in the hall seemed louder than thunder. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Each swing marked the shrinking distance between me and the storm I knew was coming. I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by folders and notebooks, the lamp throwing long shadows across the wood. The weight of evidence my grandparents had left behind was heavy but reassuring, like stone walls rising around me. Yet the sound of that clock refused to let me forget time was moving, and soon they would arrive. Dorothy bustled at the stove, her presence steady grounding. The smell of onions and herbs filled the air, a small comfort against the anxiety that clung to me. She chopped vegetables with the precision of someone who had spent decades caring for this household, and though she said little, the clatter of knife against cutting board was a rhythm of reassurance. I watched her for a moment, letting the ordinary sound soothe me. In the dining room, Daniel's voice carried low and calm as he spoke on the phone. I caught fragments: restraining orders, cease and desist, legal grounds. His tone never rose, but every word was sharp, precise. When he hung up, he returned with a folder and placed it in front of me. "Tomorrow they'll come," he said, his eyes steady on mine. "We'll be ready." I nodded, though my throat was dry. The pacing of the evening shifted between quiet moments and sudden jolts of urgency. The phone rang, another paper arrived by email, and another plan was discussed. Then stillness again, broken only by the simmer of soup on the stove and the relentless tick of the clock. As the sun sank lower, light slanted through the tall windows, painting the room in gold. Dust motes floated in the beam, glowing briefly before fading into shadow. The beauty of it caught me off guard. My grandparents had loved this time of day when the garden glowed and the house felt warm. Now it was a battlefield preparing for siege. Daniel reviewed the evidence once more. He spread out photographs, letters, and statements. Every piece was linked, a chain forged by years of preparation. "This isn't just paperwork, Claire," he said. "It's their voice, their protection. Remember that when they try to break you." The pendulum swung. Tick-tock. The sound burrowed deeper into my chest. Then my phone buzzed on the table. I hesitated before picking it up. The message lit the screen, its words slicing through the calm veneer of the evening. "Better sleep with one eye open. Brian." My stomach dropped. My hands trembled so hard I nearly dropped the phone. Dorothy saw my face pale and came to my side, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. Daniel read the message over my shoulder, his expression darkening. "This is exactly what I expected." He pulled another paper from his folder and set it aside. "Another piece for tomorrow." The twist was cruel in its simplicity. It wasn't just greed anymore. It was a threat. My brother, the same boy I once shared swings with in the park, was now warning me to fear the night. I felt the walls of the house close tighter, the shadows lengthen. I forced myself to breathe steady and slow. My grandparents had trusted me to face this. I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I looked at Daniel, and my voice, though quiet, was firm. "Then we'll be ready." The evening dragged and flew at once, moments blurring together. Dorothy served bowls of soup, insisting we eat her care, a quiet act of defiance against the chaos. Between spoonfuls, Daniel explained the order of steps, the witnesses who would arrive, and the roles each person would play. Every detail was mapped, every possibility considered. Outside, the last of the sunlight slipped away the windows, darkening into mirrors. The kitchen light glowed against the glass, my reflection pale and determined. The garden beyond disappeared into shadow. The clock struck 8. Its chimes reverberated through the house, solemn, relentless. We fell silent, listening, each of us lost in thought. I remembered my grandmother's words from the notebook. Love without preparation is fragile. They had prepared for this. Now it was my turn to carry that preparation into the storm. By 9, the table was cleared of food and covered in documents again. Daniel double-checked signatures, clipped pages neatly, and slid them into labeled folders. He handed me one thicker than the rest. Keep this with you. No matter what happens tomorrow, this proves their intent. I held it like it might burn the weight heavier than stone. The clock began to chime the hour. 1, 2, 3, until it reached 9, each note ringing sharp in the stillness. I closed my eyes, listening. Each strike felt like a drumbeat heralding the dawn of something unavoidable. When the final note faded, I opened my eyes. Outside, the night was absolute. Inside, the lamplight glowed against papers and tired faces. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. But tonight, we had done everything possible. Preparation, silence, and resolve filled the house. The pendulum swung on, tick-tock, tick-tock. And somewhere beyond the dark windows, dawn was already on its way. The morning came with a sharp knock at the front door. My chest tightened, every muscle braced, but when the door opened, it wasn't my father storming in first. It was Judge Henderson, tall and dignified, followed closely by Chief Williams, her uniform crisp, her eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. For a moment, I simply stood frozen at the sight of them, in my grandparents' foyer, two figures of law and order planted firmly where chaos was expected. Dorothy handed them coffee like she always did with visitors, her movements calm, steady, as if this were just another Sunday morning. Daniel greeted them with clipped words, then gestured for me to sit at the long oak table. Papers and folders were stacked neatly in front of each seat. The house felt less like home and more like a courtroom waiting for the gavel to fall. Then the doorbell rang again, this time sharp and insistent. Carlos opened it, and in poured my family father in his pressed suit, mother clicking her heels across the floor, Brian smirking behind his sunglasses, Aunt Janet already muttering complaints. They stopped short when they saw who was waiting. My father's jaw tensed. "Robert," he barked at the judge, his voice dripping with false familiarity. "What are you doing here?" Judge Henderson didn't flinch. "At the request of Thomas and Margaret Whitaker, I am here to ensure their wishes are honored." My mother's voice was high, incredulous. "This is outrageous. This is a family matter." Chief Williams stepped forward, her presence filling the room. "It becomes my matter if anyone crosses the line." Her tone carried steel. The pacing turned electric, words snapping across the table like sparks. My father demanded explanations. My mother sniffed about propriety. Brian snarled about fairness. Daniel sat calmly, sliding the first folder across the polished wood. Inside were bank statements showing transfers requested and never repaid, signatures circled in red ink, forged checks that bore my father's handwriting. I watched color drain from his face as Daniel laid each sheet before him. Next came the emails, my mother's messages filled with demands, threats disguised as pleasantries. "We all know this estate belongs to us. Don't make us take it to court." The words glared from the page like open wounds. She tried to dismiss them, waving her hand, but her voice faltered. Then Carlos stepped forward with the laptop. He pressed play, and on the screen appeared my mother's figure rifling through drawers the night of the funeral, pearls slipping into her purse. Gasps filled the room. My mother's face went pale, then red, her words stumbling. "That's taken out of context." Another clip followed Brian in the garage, shoving watches into a duffel bag. His smirk froze on screen, damning in its arrogance. He snapped at me across the table. "You set this up." But the evidence spoke louder than his protest. The churning energy built until Daniel laid down the leather notebook. He opened to a page and read aloud in my grandmother's handwriting. "Edward demanded money for another scheme. When refused, he accused us of betrayal. Claire visits, often brings food, and asks nothing." The contrast is clear. The room shifted. My father slammed his palm against the table, snarling. "They were manipulated. Senile. This doesn't prove anything." Judge Henderson's voice cut through the clamor, deep and unwavering. Any court would uphold this will. The preparation is meticulous. The evidence is irrefutable. My father's chair screeched back as he rose, towering, his face twisted in rage. You'll regret this, Claire. He pointed a shaking finger inches from my face. You're nothing without us. Chief Williams moved forward, her hand near her holster, her tone firm. Enough. Step back. For a long second, no one breathed. Then my father turned sharply, his coat whipping behind him. My mother gathered her bag with shaking hands, avoiding the eyes of those around her. Brian cursed under his breath, his sneakers squeaking as he stormed out. Aunt Janet sniffed, muttering about betrayal, but followed them to the door. The slam echoed through the house when the door shut behind them, the sound final reverberating like a verdict delivered. I sat trembling, my hands pressed flat to the table, feeling the smooth grain beneath my palms. Before me stood a wall of folders, papers, records, a fortress of truth my grandparents had left. Not even family could break it. Dorothy placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Daniel began to collect the documents, his expression calm but resolute. Judge Henderson gave me a nod of quiet approval. Chief Williams lingered a moment longer, her gaze steady. You did nothing wrong, Claire. Remember that. As the house settled into silence again, I looked at the empty chairs across the table, still warm from where my family had sat. They had come armed with greed and threats, but left defeated by facts. Justice, I realized, didn't always roar. Sometimes it stood quietly, dressed in paper and ink, ready to be revealed at the right moment. I walked into the living room with the morning sun flooding through the wide windows, turning the dust in the air into tiny flecks of gold. The storm had passed. My family's voices, their threats and snarls, no longer echoed through these walls. The house breathed differently now, lighter, freer, as though relieved it no longer had to pretend. I carried the quilt in my arms and placed it carefully across the back of the armchair facing the fireplace. It looked small against the wide cushions, yet it radiated something larger than comfort. It radiated presence. My grandmother's stitches still held each square, whispering memory and strength. I sat for a long while just looking at it, letting the quiet wash over me. The pacing of my days had been chaos for weeks, funerals, confrontations, evidence, threats. Now time slowed almost too much. I could hear the tick of the clock upstairs, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the rustle of leaves outside. For the first time since their deaths, the silence didn't scare me. It soothed me. On the mantel above the fireplace rested the framed photograph of my grandparents, the one they had kept in the hallway. I rose and placed my hand gently against the glass, my reflection blending with their smiles. They left me more than money. They left me values. The words came out softly, almost a prayer. The twist in my story was not the inheritance. It was what I chose to do with it. While my parents had measured love in dollars and possessions, I chose differently. I returned to my classroom at the elementary school, surprising everyone who thought I would abandon teaching the moment wealth found me. But my work there mattered more than ever. I quietly established the Whitaker Foundation, dedicated to giving children opportunities they could never afford otherwise. Scholarships, resources, and after-school programs. It wasn't about grand announcements. It was about impact. I didn't buy a mansion or luxury cars. I kept the house my grandparents built because it carried their touch. I drove the same modest car, shopped in the same aisles. My life changed, yes, but not in the ways my family expected. My grandparents' lesson echoed daily: money is a tool, not a measure of worth. And I wielded it, as they would have wanted, with restraint, with care. The pacing of my healing was uneven. Some mornings I woke feeling strong, others I found myself clutching the quilt, aching for their voices. But slowly grief turned from a sharp wound into a quieter companion. Each act of giving stitched something back together inside me. One evening, as I prepared dinner, Dorothy sat at the table peeling apples. She looked up and said, "They would be proud, Claire. More proud than you can imagine." Tears filled my eyes, but they were different tears than before, not of loss, but of gratitude. Another time, Carlos came in from the garden dirt on his hands and told me the tomatoes were thriving, just like when Thomas tended them. I smiled, remembering my grandfather's words about staking stems so they grew straight. Everything needs support. I realized then that I had become that support for others. The image of my parents still haunted me, occasionally. My father's fury, my mother's coldness, Brian's threats. But the weight of their absence became lighter as the weight of my chosen family grew heavier. Around my table now sat Dorothy, Carlos, Daniel, neighbors who had loved my grandparents and children whose lives were changing through the foundation. This was family too. Blood was not the only bond that mattered. The quilt remained in the living room, not folded away, but displayed a daily reminder. On mornings when light streamed through the window, it seemed to glow, every patch a testament to resilience. Sometimes I sat with it draped across my knees, notebook open, writing letters to my grandparents. I told them about the scholarships awarded, about the laughter in my classroom, about the garden blooming again. I told them I was okay. One morning I stood by their graves, fresh flowers in hand. The air was crisp, the sky impossibly blue. I whispered the words I had carried for weeks. I will honor you not with monuments, but with lives touched. That is the legacy you wanted. When I returned home, I walked to the mantel, placed my hand again on the photograph, and whispered, "Thank you." The sun poured through the window at that exact moment, flooding the room in gold, touching the quilt, the photo, my face. It felt like an answer. The story of the estate, the confrontation, the legal battles, all of it was part of me now. But it no longer defined me. What defined me was choice. To turn pain into purpose. To turn loss into legacy. To turn wealth into something more valuable than itself. I sat once more in the armchair, facing the quilt, the morning light streaming across the floorboards. I lifted my gaze and looked directly into the quiet of the room, as if looking through the lens of a camera, through the invisible eyes of whoever might hear my story. What would you do if your family chose money over love? Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.